Hey guys, welcome to Social Studies class and our continued exploration of the Great War, or the war to end all wars, whichever you'd like to call it. I'm not going to call it World War I. Well, I probably will, but I shouldn't, because the reality is no one at the time called it World War I, because that implies there's a World War II. World War I is a construct of historians. Everyone at the time called it the Great War. It was the Great War. All the countries were drawn in. Everybody was there. Nobody wanted to be there, and that's important. Nobody. The Germans didn't want war. The French didn't want war. The Russians didn't want war. The Austro-Hungarians didn't want a giant war with everybody. The British didn't want war. The Belgians certainly didn't want a war. The Serbians didn't want a war. They were going to lose. Austria wanted to attack Serbia. We looked at the causes, at how all this spiraled out of control, but I want to emphasize it spiraled out of control even though nobody actually wanted it to. Everybody wanted limited, small confrontations. But what everybody was more concerned about than not having a war is they didn't want to lose a war. And so they all felt, based on their plans, based on their predictions, based on their military buildups, that if they didn't mobilize first and take action, they would be at the negative end. And that's really what pushed everybody to war. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, sent a message to his cousin, I think it was, the Tsar of Russia. No, don't worry, don't mobilize your troops. Austria wants to invade Serbia. Don't worry, no worries. But if you do mobilize your troops, we're going to have to mobilize our troops. But we really don't want to attack you, so don't mobilize your troops. And the Tsar was like, cool. And then the Russians mobilized their troops anyway, because the Austrians were mobilizing their troops. So the Germans mobilized their troops. So the French mobilized their troops. And the Germans attacked France because, as I showed you in the system of alliances. And so what you had was a system of deterrence that in a lot of ways actually drove countries to war that didn't want war. The British and the French were constantly trying to avoid a war. The French did want payback from the Germans. I emphasize that. The end of the Franco-Prussian War. But they wanted to make sure they'd win, and nobody was sure they were going to win this war. So this wasn't when anybody wanted to do it. And really, without the British, they almost definitely wouldn't have won a war with Germany. They'd have been crushed without the British and the Russians. So all these things kick into place, and everyone winds up stuck in this war that nobody wants, and they all think it'll be quick because they think their plan is perfect. Well, we'll see. So I'm going to dig into that here. I'm going to look at the actual technologies, actually. The war plans will wait for another video. I'll talk about the Western Front. But the war to end all wars. That was the other thing I started calling it, because it just became this enormous conflict, and everybody thought, how can we possibly ever have a war like this? There's so much destruction. Well, guess what? World War II is coming! So then we started calling it World War I, because the Great War and the war to end all wars no longer applied after World War II. So let's dig into what made this Great War so great. And that requires a look back. I call this video Old Tactics, New Technology. Because what was going on at the start of World War I is everybody had this idea in their heads of how war was fought. And I've tried to allude to that a bit in these past videos because of all these colonial wars where the Europeans march up and conquer the people who are savages and primitive and don't have proper weapons to fight back with. And the Europeans are like, we've got cool new toys, ha ha ha, glory. And warfare at the beginning of World War I was still basically based the way it was in the Napoleonic Wars, in the American War of Independence, and had been for hundreds of years since the invention of the musket, and that was line tactics. That's not what I meant. Oh, no, actually, here we go. I want you to look at this picture. This is the French army in World War I, marching in a line with bayonets. That is how war was fought for hundreds of years. Everybody lines up next to each other. You look at the enemy, you wait, aiming at him, your officer says, fire, and you all fire. And then if you're confident and a bunch of them die, you might reload and try to fire again, or you pull out your bayonet and you charge them. This is how war had been fought. This is how people tried to fight at the beginning of World War I. This was idiotic at any point in history. It was beyond idiotic in World War I because it was designed off the premise of 17th, 18th century weapons, muskets, that fired slowly that were extremely inaccurate, where the only way to hit a target was to have everybody massed together. And so you're all in a line and they're all in a line and no one can aim and you all just fire and enough shots fire that a bunch of people die. And then you go and most of the death happens to your bayonet charges and then somebody runs away and you take the field. Because the guns were primitive and terrible. So that's how war had been fought. There's a problem. The guns aren't primitive and terrible anymore. So let's dig into that. And I want that picture right, because that is the French army in World War I in 1914, marching in a line. Never fight that way. Never let anybody tell you should ever fight that way. It's stupid. So again, in this old school form of fighting back in the day, muskets could fire about 3 rounds a minute. That was a really well-trained guy. Could fire 3 shots in a minute. Every 20 seconds, bam, and he takes it and cleans it out, puts his bullet in, puts his gunpowder in, ramrods it down, goes back down, and then he repeats the process. So your 2 lines are standing there, and everybody is firing 3 shots a minute, and like I said, you fire a couple shots, and then you charge, because you really want to get in there with those bayonets and stab, which is like practically the same as fighting back in the Spartans and the Greeks. But anyway, it's a spear with a gun attached. Or a gun with a spear attached, either way. But since the 17th century and the Napoleonic Wars and the American Revolution, there have been some innovations. We talked about this with the American Revolution. We talked about rifling and how the American sharpshooters used rifles. That was like 150 years before World War I, give or take. More like 130. But rifling made guns accurate, so you could actually hit what you were shooting at. Again, we mentioned this, officer deaths are going to be extremely high in World War I because everybody can target the officers, unlike in those Napoleonic Wars where the guns were inaccurate. And then they made pointed bullets that made them even more accurate. So all of a sudden, instead of having a bunch of inaccurate guns that can shoot 100 meters away, where a 100-meter dash, I could sprint that in 12, 13 seconds. Okay, with full gear, maybe it's 15 to 20 seconds. That's not really long enough for the enemy to reload and get another shot off. Remember, if you're shooting 3 shots a minute, whenever you decide to charge, you're charging. But pointed bullets mean we can shoot farther and more accurately. Rifling means we can shoot farther and more accurately. Then they invented what's called breech-loading rifles, and this happened in the American Civil War, 1860, 50 years before World War I. They had repeating rifles, where instead of having to ramrod it down from the end, you just popped out a cartridge right where you were and popped a new one in. Breech-loading. Right there. You're not taking your gun and switching it around. You're just fire and then fire. That was faster. And then repeating rifles came along. They put in a clip with like 7 shells. Popped it in. Bam. 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 American cavalry had this in 1865. And it revolutionized the American Civil War because a few men with repeating rifles could gun down an entire posse of men with muskets. So this is a lesson that should have been learned 50 years earlier at the minimum, but Europe hadn't fought anybody else with technology. All they'd fought was primitive colonial wars against people that were still fighting with bows and arrows and things. So they didn't, I mean, they knew how effective these weapons were. Ooh, look, the natives are dying. Ho ho. We're so glorious and mighty. No, we're not. We have superior technology. But they weren't fighting each other with it. So they didn't realize how stupid it made their tactics. And this brings us to the Lee Enfield 303. The Lee Enfield 303, as evidenced in this picture, was the standard firearm of the British Army in World War I. Now I want you to see it has a clip with multiple shells. It is breech loading, so they don't have to move the gun out of the way. It's a bolt-action rifle, and just for a sense, the Lee Enfield 303, a trained British rifleman, and the British Army starts the war as a trained army, not a conscript army, could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. That's conservative. Some estimates say maybe as many as 30 aimed rounds per minute. Every couple of seconds, you can fire a Lee Enfield. Bang, aim, bang, aim, bang, aim, bang. Well, actually, it's a bolt action. It's a bang, bolt action, bang, bolt action. It's not quite as fast as a modern semi-automatic handgun. But that's 1 shot every 3 seconds. Not 3 shots a minute, 20 shots a minute. 6 times as many shots. And you could fire a Lee Enfield 303 accurately at 500 meters. I used to sprint the quarter mile in track. That's 400 meters. And it would take about 54 seconds, just under a minute, at my top training. with no gear and no weapons, at the peak of my physical condition, in that minute, a British rifleman could shoot me 20 times. 20. And with a bunch of gear, marching, you're maybe at a jog. It's going to take you 3-5 minutes, something like that, to cross that 500 meters. And in 5 minutes, every single rifleman on the other side can put 100 rounds into your line of men standing in a line, marching together. Do you understand the stupidity of warfare I am talking about? So, we have a bunch of generals, old generals. Ah, yes, colonial wars. The Napoleonic Wars worked with bayonet charges. I think let's try bayonet charges here. The Germans are going to learn this lesson really hard when the British waylay them in their advance. Because, again, the British are better trained at the beginning, and not everybody can fire quite that fast, which is why I give you the 15 to 20 figure, not the 30 figure. But rifles are going to be absurdly deadly in the early phases of World War I, because people are being idiots. Generals are being idiots. And when you have you can't miss when a bunch of guys are standing shoulder to shoulder in front of you, and you have half decent aim with a Lee Enfield. You're going to shoot down 20, 40, 50 of them single-handedly, not to mention everybody else next to you. It's a death trap. So, but it gets even better, because we have another invention by World War I, and that's called the machine gun. And if there is any reason to believe that every single general in World War I should have been court-martialed and murdered before the war even began for thinking about using line tactics, it's because every army had machine guns. Machine guns that could fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute. And every division only had so many machine guns, but it didn't matter when the enemy was marching shoulder to shoulder next to each other up in an open field, and you can shoot 400 rounds of your machine gun per minute, and each of your riflemen can shoot 20 more rounds per minute. What happened is every invading army is met by a wall of unspeakable firepower that they've never faced before. And bold frontal charges, line tactics, the mainstay strategy of all of European warfare for 200 years, was utter stupidity and slaughter in World War I. We'll get into that when we talk about the battles. But this has changed warfare. This technology has changed warfare, and none of the generals know it yet. Nobody realizes how completely ineffective it's going to be. Everybody thinks that, like in the Franco-Prussian War and the other previous wars, if you just mass enough men, you can break through and surround the enemy and blow them up with your artillery. You cannot mass enough men to charge through 450 to 600 rounds per minute from every machine gun in their line and 20 rounds per minute from every rifle in their line. If their line is there, you're just going to get yourself killed. And one of the main reasons this happens, as I've alluded to, is because, and why this is stupidity, and they knew it, is because the machine gun was the super weapon of the colonial wars. In Africa, they came up with this line: whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. A very good British colonial thing to say, and here you have this British division with their rifles, probably Lee Enfield 303s, and their machine gun, standing there looking all rugged and dramatic. And you have reports from battles where 15,000 African warriors charge a division of British and they get slaughtered. And they take 15,000 casualties. And the British lose 4 men. And they're like, glorious victory! No! Total technological superiority. I mean, yes, that is a glorious victory. But the reason it happened is that, and the fact that the British commanders didn't put 2 and 2 together and go, this same weapon that we are using to slaughter our enemies in our colonial territories by the tens of thousands can slaughter us by the tens of thousands if we're the ones charging into it, is madness. But that's what's going to happen. So you have old tactics and new technology, and it's a recipe for disaster. But let's go deeper. Why is it such a recipe for disaster? Well, the answer to that comes from our second point, and that is trench warfare. Because if both lines are lining up, shoulder to shoulder, Napoleon War style, American Revolution style, At least you can both shoot machine guns. And if you can both shoot each other with your machine guns, well, then at least you can kill them too, right? Then we're just going to kill everybody. But that's not what happens. This is going to become a completely defensive war because what devolves is trench warfare. This is what the Japanese and the Russians learned in the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese built these sophisticated trenches and slaughtered Russian charges. And the Russians built sophisticated trenches and slaughtered Japanese charges. We've been here before in 1905, but nobody paid attention to that part. Sorry, World War I is really depressing. So what happens is both sides, as the war goes on, and I'll get into it later when I talk about the battles, will dig long trenches that face each other. And these trenches will run for miles and miles and miles across the border between France and Germany. Basically, every ounce of land will eventually be trenched, have a trench through it. And in that trench is a bunch of men with machine guns and rifles. And here's the real problem is the enemy is crossing the open field. The defender is down in a trench where they can't be shot. Here's the German trenches on the Aisne. This is one of the first battles, early battles of the war, 1914. So while the French are all up marching out in the open, the Germans are all down in a trench where they can't be hit, unleashing unspeakable firepower on the French advance. And what this leads to is a stalemate, because as soon as the Germans get done shooting all the French, ha-ha, the French are dead! They blow the whistle, they get up and they charge over their trench and they run over and the French are at their trench with their machine guns. No one can do anything. And so here's our trench and here's their trench. And we're basically staring at each other across the trenches, waiting for the enemy to attack. But whoever attacks is dead. Every single time, basically. Occasionally they do take trenches. Occasionally there are victories at huge losses. And then the enemy just takes the trench back. But what this devolves into is trench warfare is the defining feature of World War I, because really quickly everybody figures out that if I'm in a trench and you're in the open, you're dead and I'm not. And I can, with a few men, inflict unspeakable casualties on you with a couple machine guns and some rifles. So both sides build trenches and dig in. And unlike the Franco-Prussian War, where the German army swept in and took the thing, and the Russo-Japanese War, where they swept in and took the Port Arthur, and World War II, where everybody's going to sweep in and take things, World War I is an incredibly stationary war. The vast majority of the war is fought over a very small amount of land where these trench lines are, and they do not move very far. So why are they so dangerous? Well, let's get closer again and point it out. In part because it's not just one trench. You've got a frontline trench. We got a bunch of guys and machine guns. Behind them, you've got a support trench with blockhouses for machine guns and more men. Behind that, you've got a reserve trench. So if the enemy does manage to take your first trench, your reserve trench then gets up and charges back into them from the support trench while they're attacking your trench. They're being shot at from your trench and the support trench, both because the support trench is higher, often can shoot at the enemy too. In front of the trench is a little thing called barbed wire, which I'll talk about later. The stretch between the trenches has been churned up by artillery fire because there's mass amounts of artillery being fired in this time, and that means that there's a bunch of holes in the ground, giant craters that people have to climb over and around to slow that advance through the middle. You cannot just run. It's not an open field track. It's a land with hills and holes and things all over the place, and perhaps unexploded bombs that might even blow up. And while you're going across it, there's also artillery placed well behind the lines that is bombarding you as you're going across, because the guy on the radio gets radio, they're charging, and artillery just starts bombing no man's land and dropping cannon shells on there. Aircraft sometimes are flying overhead and shooting at you while you charge. In the second line trenches, there are often dugouts 15 meters below ground so that artillery fire can't hit them. So you think, oh good, our artillery has taken you down and your defenders, and we can charge your trench. But no, we can't, because the second trench is fully ready to defend it. You understand why defense has an advantage? It's just a death trap for anyone attacking. And everybody on defense has this on both sides. Trench after trench after trench, backed up by artillery, fronted by barbed wire. It's an extremely sophisticated measure that you'd think the generals would have thought of before they started sending millions of men to their death in this war. You need a way to break it. If you can't break the trenches, all you're going to do is get your people killed. Now, what again makes them so deadly? Barbed wire, Mr. John. Who cares about barbed wire? Ooh, little metal pieces together. I don't think you understand. barbed wire was incredibly deadly. First of all, you might be thinking of a barbed wire fence like you'd have around a livestock pen or around somebody's yard. You climb over it. No, look at this picture. It's a labyrinth of wire. It's a tangled web in front of a trench that you have to get through. This stuff catches on you, and what it does is it creates a fence that you can shoot through. So all those Lee Enfield rifles and those machine guns can shoot at you while you run up and you finally get past. Okay, 5-10 minutes later, you've crossed no man's land. You're still alive. Oh, goodness, how am I getting through this barbed wire? And you're standing there getting caught on the barbed wire, and as soon as you get caught, you get shot. And then your body joins the others in the tangle. And so they make these incredibly sophisticated webs of barbed wire in front of the trenches. And while you're trying to climb the barbed wire, they're all down in their trench. No one, after the first day of ever attacking trenches, should have ever attacked trenches again, and they do it for 4 years on both sides. At least not a frontal attack like they're going to do, not line tactics. And here's the problem, is these line tactics don't die in 1914. You'd think they would. You'd think that in the first year of the war, everybody would charge a trench and die and realize this is a terrible idea, but they don't. The generals keep using them, even though the barbed wire gets more sophisticated and more machine guns get put into place and more artillery gets put into place and the trenches get more sophisticated. They don't stop. And then it gets even better, because the next factor that characterized World War I was gas warfare. Because you gotta break the trench! Sorry about the extremely brutal pictures. You've got to break the trench. So everybody's trying to figure out, how do we break the trench? Well, in 1899, lethal gas warfare was outlawed at the Treaty of The Hague. That's in Denmark. And the idea was, this is horrible. Europeans developed gas. They kind of tested it out on their colonies because, they treated their people in their colonies like not people. And they're like, oh, this is super effective at crushing rebellion. We use gas and poison them to death. And they're like, oh, that's awful. Let's not use that in war. And everybody got together like, yes, I will not use gas. I will not use gas. We will not use gas. And in 1914, the French used gas because it was awful. They couldn't break the trenches. They had no idea what to do. And they're like, well, we've got to break through. So what can we do? Well, if you're in a trench, the trench is low. Gas tends to be heavy. It sinks into the trench. So if we bombard you with gas, tear gas in this case, all your defenders will be going and blinded and confused, and we can charge across no man's land and stab you with our bayonets, glory. Tear gas gets used all the time today on protesters and things. It's a non-lethal gas, and the French used it in 1914 to take a German trench. Aha, we figured it out. We've got a solution. Well, the Germans aren't going to sit there and take that line down. So the Germans will respond not only with tear gas, but with lethal gas. And this takes us to a whole new realm of warfare and makes World War I even more terrible. Because now you're not safe in the trench anymore. You never were. You could be bombarded by enemy artillery. You're all in a line. That's pretty easy to figure out where it is. And the enemy is constantly bombarding you with artillery. But now they're not just bombarding you with artillery. They're bombarding you with gas. So if you're in the trench, there's a good chance you can get blown up by by artillery, or choked to death, or poisoned by gas. If you're outside the trench, you're probably going to get machine gunned. This is why there should be no World War I shooting games. Apparently they're making them. I do not understand how. They cannot be accurate. And that brings us to gas masks. Because, of course, we're all about escalation. So as soon as the French start using gas and the Germans start using poison gas, there are a few very effective gas attacks, and then everybody starts mass-producing gas masks and distributing them to their men. Now, in the early stages especially, besides looking like this picture is straight out of a horror movie, I love the guy on the bottom right who looks like he has a mustache on his gas mask. Anyway, and the guy on the middle left who I think is just has a bandana and is going to die. You have wildly different gas masks, because kind of like we see today where we're trying to mass produce masks and we can't mass produce enough masks for everybody, and second from bottom right, no mask. I don't feel good for that guy. You have wildly different designs that are going to get created, and everybody gets whatever they can get their hands on and puts together a gas mask, because there aren't just standard issue masks that everybody's going to have that are all the same, and they're testing out new designs, and they're trying to figure out what works. By the end of the war, everybody will have gas masks. In the middle phases, it's a lot more varied, and sometimes it's better than others. Again, by the end of the war, even the dogs will have gas masks, so don't worry. Your furry friends are safe. I believe this is a real picture from World War One. And dogs were often in the trenches because some of the gases humans couldn't smell fast enough, and dogs could smell them faster. So the dogs would smell the gas and alert the humans, and they'd throw gas masks on everybody before the gas got there and killed everybody. But they even had gas masks for the dogs, so don't worry. They took good care of them, too. Trench warfare is awful. There's no sugarcoating it. It was just awful. So, we're going to get to one more element of technology before I finish this video, and that is, of course, just like gas, and gas is one of them. Well, once they broke down to this stalemate, and again, I got the term stalemate there because that's the term in chess when no one can win, right? Where both of you are moving and no one can possibly beat the other, so the game is over. Nobody won. Well, that's what happens in World War I. After 1914, essentially, it breaks down into a stalemate. In the first year, I'll get into it. There's some pretty significant advances and wins and losses, and after that, it's just trench against trench, and you charge their trench and die, and they charge your trench and die, and no one can actually break the other trench. A stalemate ensues, and so then the next 3 years of the war is just everybody trying to figure out, how do we break the stalemate? How do we achieve victory? Well, the way to do that, in theory, is new technology. Probably somebody should have been working on this technology before we started a war where millions of people died in trenches. But, we hadn't gotten that far because nobody had realized that line tactics were idiotic yet. Though they should have. So, new technologies. In order to break the stalemate, we create new technologies, and so I bring you a meme because I need a break. Who would win? German soldiers who held this trench or a parallelogram-shaped metal boy, also known as a tank. So let's get to the first of those new technologies. Oh, there's the solution. The trench one, not the tank. Anyway, they invented tanks for this war. And you have a German tank on the left and a British tank on the right. And those pictures give you an idea of about how effective they are. It's a giant metal, slow death trap, okay? I hope they never make a tank mission in a World War I shooter game, because it'd just be both sides. I crashed. My engine broke. I'm stuck in the mud. Tanks are invented. The idea is we can break through the trench with this metal rolling wall of death. But they don't know how to use them. It's World War II, they're going to mass tanks. The Germans will roll in with 100 tanks in one spot, really sophisticated tanks with machine guns and cannons, and just smash through defenses. In World War I, they're like, all right, we'll put 1 tank per mile and charge. And so there's 1 million infantry charging with 1 tank, and all the infantry still gets gunned down, and the tank breaks down halfway through no man's land, because look at those treads, they're terrible. The wheels are tiny, the tank is huge, it just gets stuck in one of those big holes. And then now the crew is stuck in the middle of no man's land where they're going to get shot as soon as they leave the tank. Or they'll get cooked to death, or someone will throw a grenade at them. Or an artillery cannon will be like, giant target. On occasion they do achieve some success. For the most part, though, especially in the first battles where the British have them, at the Battle of the Somme, they bring their tanks out and use them horribly and effectively, and they don't have enough. They don't wait long enough until they've got enough. They could have been the end of trench warfare, potentially, if they'd been really massed in one position and a ton of tanks had gone through World War II style, but nobody knew how to use them, and nobody used them effectively. So the Germans are going to build primitive, ineffective tanks, and the British are going to build primitive, ineffective tanks, and most of them will wind up, stuck in a trench anyway if they even make it to the trench. How do we get this tank out of our trench, sir? Okay, fair enough. We tried. Tanks are going to revolutionize World War II. Not so good in World War I. Airplanes have just been invented, and so they're going to see their first real combat. And this is going to be great. Honestly, it's probably my favorite aerial warfare time. You can go watch Flyboys. It's a great movie about the aerial dogfights. And it brings this romanticism to World War I that it utterly lacks everywhere else, because everywhere else it's just death. But in the air, you actually have aces, guys who've shot down at least 5 enemy planes, and they put a mark on their plane for every enemy they've shot down. And both sides have really good pilots that can show off how really good they are by shooting down a bunch of enemy planes, the best of which being this guy, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, the best fighter pilot in all of World War I, flying things like triplanes, where it really seemed like skill mattered, and sophistication and piloting, and they had to rig up machine guns with the propeller, because if you didn't, you'd shoot off your own propeller and then you'd die. And so formations of planes would come into the air and have dramatic dogfights, and you had this chance for real individual heroism and glory by skill at air, because if you were really good at air, you were really good at air. Unlike on land, where you're like, I'm really good at shooting, and you still get shot by a machine gun and dead. And so the air war really was a chance for the war to be a little more interesting, for people's individual talents to shine. They also developed Zeppelins, giant airships. Airships, they're so cool. Floating above the sky and dropping bombs and gathering intel. The Germans in particular used them. The problem with Zeppelins is they powered them with hydrogen, which, if you know anything from science class, is an explosive flammable gas. And so, of course, a few incendiary rounds and bye-bye Zeppelin. But the Germans are going to use Zeppelins. There's going to be dogfights with biplanes and triplanes and their propeller jets, and the pilots are out in the open air. And in the early phases where they don't really have the machine guns rigged up yet, they have like a pistol with them, and they're flying circles around the enemy trying to shoot them with a pistol. It's dramatic. It's interesting. It doesn't make a huge difference. The airplanes allow them to see where the enemy is coming. That's really important, and direct their artillery fire. They are going to use some to bomb. If you can get a line on their trench from above, you can come down and shoot, and they're all in a row. And so if your enemy your fighters aren't there to protect you, that can be a mess for you. So they'll support attacks. They call them air cavalry. No one really envisions great aerial battles in World War I, kind of like tanks. Everything in World War I is about supporting the infantry, because there's still this belief that massed lined infantry is the way to win a war. I bring 10,000 men and we all charge into you in a line, and whoever gets to you without dying kills you when they get there. It does not work. We have a few planes supporting, we have a few tanks supporting. No one understands what they're going to understand in World War II, that an air force is crucial, and if you control the air, you win the war, because you can bomb enemy cities from the sky. No one understands what Hitler does, that mass divisions of tanks can break through enemy lines and prevent any sort of trench warfare and crush infantry divisions. They're not used right, but the technology is being invented, and that's going to revolutionize war. So they're trying, okay? I may hate on the generals, and I do hate on the generals, but they are trying to invent new technologies. They just don't know how to use them. They don't mass produce them enough. It's too little, too late, really. But it does at least give us some interesting stories in the air. You can read up about the Red Baron if you want to, and all of that. And last but not least, hand grenades and gas. Well, again, trench breakers, because of course, if you can't get to the trench and you're stuck behind the barbed wire, but you have a small portable bomb in your hand, all you have to do is land it in the trench, and the enemy has nowhere to go. So hand grenades are going to be developed as a common method of war and used pretty extensively. If you can get close enough to the trench to drop in some hand grenades, you can do some damage. But let's talk about types of gas to finish this up. So I mentioned the tear gas, the non-lethal gas the French are going to use. The main types of gas used, though, are chlorine gas first, and then mustard gas and phosgene gas. Basically, chlorine gas is deadly. The Germans are going to use it extremely effectively at the Second Battle of Ypres. They drop it on the enemy trenches and kill everybody. But they don't actually take advantage of it because they're so shocked by how effective it is, they aren't willing to charge. They're like, they're probably still there, they're probably still alive. And then the French show up, or British show up, and realize all their people are dead and have to replace them. But no advantage is actually gained. And of course, once they realize it was gas, then they start using gas masks. For the most part, chlorine gas is not effective. It's heavy, it's got color. So you can see it. You can see the gas coming, and so as soon as they see the gas coming and smell it, they throw on their masks before it can actually do too much damage. That being said, if you inhale large amounts of chlorine gas, it will kill you. It is deadly. Mustard gas will kill you. It's a far more corrosive gas. Chlorine gas, when it happens, it reacts with water, and so in your lungs it creates hydrochloric acid and kind of eats your lungs away from the inside if you breathe it in. But you can block it by just putting water on a cloth over your mouth, because then the water reacts with the gas, creating acid on the cloth instead of inside you. So it was pretty easy to defend against chlorine, which is why it didn't actually kill that many people once they kind of worked that out. Mustard gas is far more pernicious. It doesn't come around until later in the war. It's called mustard gas in part because it had this yellow color. But unlike chlorine gas, they didn't care if you got your gas mask on. I mean, if you didn't and you breathed it in and died, they were happy about that. But mustard gas would burn your skin. It was highly corrosive. And so the point behind mustard gas attacks was often, if we kill people, great, but wounding you was just as good as killing you. If you didn't get your gas mask on fast enough, the mustard gas would blind you temporarily or permanently. It could cause massive burns to any exposed skin, all of which would remove you from the front lines, often for months, while you went to the hospital and recovered, or maybe never recovered, depending on how bad your exposure was. So the important thing about World War I is we're going to talk in my next video about how it's a war of attrition, and that means it's a war trying to break the enemy down and run them out of men. Whoever runs out of men first loses. There aren't going to be great military advances. Instead, it's just kill all the enemy. But wounding was as good as killing, because you took men out of service, you took them off the lines, you got rid of them either for the whole war or for part of the war. And so mustard gas was, if we kill you, we kill you, but if we wound a bunch of you, you have to replace all the men in your trench. New men, mustard gas them again. Replace all the men in your trench. And so it's intentionally just this horribly corrosive chemical agent. Phosgene gas is actually the most deadly gas used in the war, because most of the deaths come from phosgene. It's colorless, odorless, and deadly. And so if phosgene gets out, you don't get your gas mask on in time, you're going to die. And you don't have the same warning you do with chlorine. You can't block it with a wet cloth like chlorine. Or mustard gas, again, there's going to be a warning, a terror effect. Really, men just scarred by the seeing this cloud of yellow coming towards them, blowing in the wind, and knowing when it gets there, it's going to scald and burn everything focus. And they're going to watch their friends suffer and die around them. Mustard gas is almost more a weapon of terror and just destruction. Phosgene was the deadly one, far more likely to kill you because you couldn't detect it nearly as quickly until people started choking and dying around you, at which point it was often too late. And then there are also what they call mask breaker gases. At the end of the war, they get really sophisticated. And so what they start doing is they have these gases that have small particles that are too small for a gas mask to filter out, but they're not deadly. They don't kill you. They just make you vomit uncontrollably in your gas mask. Meaning, I have two choices. I throw up in my gas mask, and I choke to death on my own vomit, or I take my gas mask off. Well, guess what they did? They mixed it. Here's a little bit of gas maker gas, and some phosgene. And this is where it gets really deadly at the end of the war. Because now, I choke to death in my mask, or I take my mask off to get rid of the vomit, and I die of the gas. There is no win. It's a lose-lose situation. That's the real sophistication. The Germans and others don't really get that sophisticated until about 1918, when they really start making mixed gas shells and have developed these mask-breaking gases. And it's just awful. Thankfully, by then the war is practically over, so it doesn't do as much as it would have, but it only would have gotten worse. And so you have this horribly pernicious gas designed to break the trench, but no one can really do it. And the problems with gas are a couple. One, haha, we gassed you. Well, we can't charge into your trench because there's gas in your trench. So if we charge in, now I die. I've got gas mask, but it's mustard gas. Oh man, we have to wait for the gas to clear. And by the time the gas clears, you resupply the trench. So it's hard to take stuff. And more deadly, as happens, I believe, to the British at one of the battles, the wind can change direction. We drop all our chlorine gas. Ha-ha! Get the enemy. Oh no, it's coming for us. Various times people gassed their own troops in World War II because the wind switched directions and blew their gas into their trench instead of into the enemy trench. Are you depressed yet? You will be. World War I is depressing. That's why no one wants to talk about it. That's why we have so many movies about World War II and video games about World War II and so few about World War I. We've started making them recently because of the centennial, and we're starting to wrestle with this. But no one came back from World War I and wanted to talk about it. It was the war to end all wars for a reason. Because it was awful. It was horrible. All these technologies were used. Nobody knew how to use them. And their main purpose wound up being just to kill. For the sake of killing, trying to bleed the enemy out of men, not trying to take territory, not strategic gains. I'm going to take this fortress, I'm going to take this land, just I'm going to kill you until you die. There aren't enough of you left to die, and then I win. And so unfortunately, that's what happens. The strategies break down. Nobody knows how to break the trenches, and so it just becomes, well, if we kill all of them in their trench, it's good enough, even if we can't take the trench. That's not good enough. War should never be fought that way. Everyone who led an army in World War I should have been brought before an international tribunal and put on trial for war crimes at the end of the war because of the murder of their men. We'll dig into the actual war in a couple of days, in a couple of videos, and look at what happened when all this technology actually got put to use. But World War I is one of those things to remind us hopefully never again, to fight a war where we don't understand the potential of the technology, where we have no idea what our weapons can do to each other, because that's what happened. We have to stay up to date on tactics. We have to not use weapons. We haven't had a major war with gas after World War One, because after World War One in 1922, everybody signed a convention, and this time they followed it. In World War Two, the Nazis did not use gas, even then, because they knew what happened in World War One, and nobody wanted to repeat that. They used gas to murder the Jews, but they did not use it in war, because they knew as soon as they did, the British would use it, the French would use it, everybody would use it, and it would be used on them. And they realized after this war that some weapons just should not be used. Some weapons' purpose is just death and achieves nothing. Gas warfare was like that. We need to learn that lesson. Kind of like nuclear warfare. Hope we never use nuclear weapons, because if we do, we're probably going to blow up the world. There are some weapons that we just should not use. And that's one of the major lessons of World War I. Just because you have technology doesn't mean you should use technology. And you certainly shouldn't use technology if you don't know what the consequences are. And sending men to their deaths for no reason doesn't accomplish very much. So there you have it. The war to end all wars. Have a good day. I'll see you next week.